Hi. This video demonstration, we're going to take a look at particles once again. We'll simplify things down a little bit. We'll use the standard particle flow to create kind of an effect where, drop stuff into a pool of mud or, vegetables into a stew or something along that line. Something I have newed into a witch's brew idea here. You can use our lock bond operator to get the right friction and that bobbing up and down and kind of sludgy look to this thing. In order to do this, we're going to need a few things to start. First of all, being some mud to drop it into. We'll do things simply this time. I'm just going to create a plane. It doesn't matter where you create your, or how big you create your plane or anything like that. We'll change it here momentarily. This plane I want to be centered in the center of our grid of our world. So I'm going to come down here to our XYZ coordinates and just right click on the spinners to zero everything out there. Then I can actually hit G to turn that grid off and get it out of my way. On the Modify tab, second tab over here, I'm going to give this, let's just go for a, 200 by 200 length and width. And we're going to give this one at least 15 segments, divided up quite a bit. We're actually going to create a partner, a twin from this guy, and we're going to give it even more segments for our final look. But for our collision object, for our mud, this will work just fine. To make it a little bit more uneven and more muddy surface rather than perfectly straight glass mirror here, we'll go ahead and add a modifier to it. That modifier is going to be a good old-fashioned noise modifier. We'll turn fractal on and maybe add 10 to the Z strength axis. If we want more detail, we can turn those iterations all the way up to 10. I like doing that. And that gives us at least a wavy surface to start from. Now, as I said, this is going to be used kind of as our collision object. So I'm going to go ahead and rename the plane by coming up here to the top on the modifier tab and highlighting plane 001, and let's rename it collision mud or collision object or something along those lines so that we know what it is. Once I've done that, we're going to make a clone of this plane. I'm just going to do that by right-clicking and selecting clone from the quad menu that shows up. We want to make this this clone and a copy for our object, not an instance, because otherwise everything we change will happen to the clone of it. And we'll give it a new name. That's going to be our, let's call it our renderable mud, and say OK. With the renderable mud selected, I'm actually going to go ahead right away and come back down in our stack underneath the noise to the plane, and instead of 15 segments in each, let's go crazy with like 60 segments in each of those, which is going to give us a lot more detail. But we don't want all of those polygons when we're working with particles, because more particles, more polygons colliding with each other means our computers have to think even harder, and the opportunity for a crash is even greater. What we do want, however, is I'm going to move this. You guys don't have to as you're following along, but I want to move this up and down just so you can see that the curvature of our mud, even though the second one has some more bumps and is showing through a lot, that main curvature of our puddle of mud is the same as our smaller version. So once we've done that, we can go ahead and actually right-click and hide the renderable mud, but leave the collision mud here for now, and we'll come back and adjust that renderable mud later on. The collision object here, our collision mud here, we don't need it to render at all in the final version. So I'm also going to right-click on it now that I've got it selected again. Come down to our object properties, and I'm just going to uncheck the renderable button so that I don't have to worry about having two of these guys fighting for competition in our final version. Some other things we're going to need. Let's go back to our Create tab and all the way over to our Space Warps button here, the three wavy lines, or as some of my students like to call it, the bacon button. And we need a couple of things from this list. Well, we only need one thing, actually. We need gravity, because we're dropping something into this sludge. So let's go ahead and in our top view, I'm going to create a gravity. I'm creating my top view because that automatically makes the arrow point down, and I want my gravity to point down. That being said, later on, if you want something to fall sideways, just turn that arrow pointing the other direction. We'll adjust our gravity here momentarily, but while we're at the Space Warps button, let's change the drop-down list from forces to deflectors. And we're going to need a deflector as well. Now, we want this chaotic randomized surface to be our deflector shape, so that tells me I need to use the U deflector, which comes equipped with that nice pick object button. So I'm going to create one of those in my top view here as well. Then I'm going to go over to my Modify tab. My U deflector is still selected. All I want to do, I don't need to change any of the other values for this one. We're going to do that in particle flow, but all I want to do is make sure I click the pick object button and then select my collision mud from the scene here. Then I can go to my gravity, and let's drop down the strength. We don't need it quite at 1 because that'll make our objects fall at a little bit too much of a rapid rate. Let's drop that down to like 0.4 or something along those lines. And those are the only settings we need to bother with there. After that, we are pretty much ready to jump into particle flow. In order to do that, make sure you've got your keyboard shortcut override toggle. That's this guy right here in the on position. Otherwise, the hotkey won't work. The hotkey is 6 once that is depressed to open up particle view. Again, if you don't want to use that, you can always come up to our graph editors, and particle view is in that menu as well. Once particle view is opened, we can go ahead and start building our particles. First thing we need is one of these empty flows. You can start with a preset or a standard flow, but we're going to build this one from scratch, so empty is what we want to do. That being done, I want to immediately either select the heading PF source 001, which brings up the particle flow icons settings right here, where I like to immediately change what it defaults us with, which is only showing 50% of our particles in the actual viewport. I want all of my particles showing, so I'm going to put 100% in there. I'm also going to change the length and width. We can change it right here, or we can actually come over and select the icon, which is now shown up in our viewport. That's the little orange one with the arrow on it. And over in the Modify tab, we can also change these settings and do anything we want to do. They will match pretty well perfectly. I'm going to make mine, let's see, we made our plane, I believe 200 by 200, so I want something smaller than that. Let's just go with 150 by 150 so that it stays within the boundaries, and that way anything that splashes won't look like it's splashing all the way out or falling on the edge and getting a big splash or anything like that. We'll get these guys well contained. I also want to raise this up. I can do that by simply grabbing the move tool and on my z-axis just moving it up, but I like to be a little bit more exact than that, so I'm going to come down, my move tool selected, that's this guy up here in the top ribbon, and then my particle flow icon, my PF source icon selected, come down to the z-axis and let's just bump it up to 100 units above there. I'm just using generic units. It doesn't matter. However high you want this stuff to fall from is where you're going to place this icon in the future. For this, 100 will work just fine for us. Alright, next we need, now that we've got an icon, our particle source has been created, we're ready to create some particles here, we need a birth operator. We always have to have one of these guys. There's several to choose from. This time we're going to use the regular birth. Most of the time I do. And we're going to go ahead and connect that first blue node dongle here into the empty circle node for our event 1, which means that now that we've got a render operator, which comes along with our empty flow, the particle flow source icon has been created. Now we get to make particles, which is in fact giving them birth or having them be born. We want our particles, let's see, I've got, it looks like I've got 250 frames here. I don't think I need that much, so I'm going to go back to default, which is what you guys should have. I must have been working on something else. I only need 100 frames for this one, I think. We can always stretch it out later and more if we feel like, but for 100 frames for this will be fine. Let's say we have our emit start at 0 and our emit stop halfway through at 50. And 200 particles is a bit much. Let's try 20. 20, 25. If you want lots, we can go 25. You know, you can change that based on your needs. Next, now that I've told the particles they are allowed to be born, I need to tell them where they are born from. We have two options for this: the position icon or the position object. The position object allows us to choose a model from our scene and have the particles be born on or inside that model. The position icon tells it to create particles based on this icon. We've taken the time to set this icon up with 150 rectangular shape, so we might as well use position icon for this. That being said, you really can have those particles come from a model of some sort if you ever need it. The default value of volume is just fine for us. That means the particles will be allowed to be born all over this icon, which is why we set it up to be 150 over 150. That being said, we're not seeing our particles. If I slide between 0 and 50 frames, our particles will show up. They don't do much yet because we haven't given them any other instructions. Then you are allowed to be born on our icon. They're little blue tick marks right now because, hey, that's the default display that comes along with our birth event there that we created. Any brand new event comes with a display automatically, and it is always set to type ticks with a random color. I'm going to go ahead and change this to geometry. All the ticks will change to X's, not a big change in effect, but once I give them a little bit more information, those X's will change to actual geometric models or shapes. Which brings us to our next operator. I'm going to go ahead and come down to the depot here where I've got a shape operator and drag that and drop it underneath the position icon. The shape operator gives me a host of generic shapes to choose from, cube being the first one. I think for the example I just showed you, we chose dodecahedron, so we'll start there again. That being said, that most of the time if you're dropping something into the mud, you probably don't want it to be a standard shape, but you'll probably want it to be a model. Let's pretend that we're making pea soup or something here. We'll want to model out a pea, texture it, etc., and use it instead of our standard shape. If that would be the case, you want a stalk of broccoli, you want eye of newt, etc., falling into our witch's brew here, you're going to use the shape instance instead. If I bring that up here, you'll notice that it's got a button that we can click and then select a model from our scene. I'm not going to do that because I don't have a model from our scene for right now, so I'm just going to right-click and get rid of the shape instance. We're going to go with shape on this one and just use one of these standard dodecahedrons. I'm going to give it a size, something bigger, maybe 15. And then I'm going to check mark that scale percentage box on our shape, which tells me I can either immediately shrink it. I don't know why I gave it a size there if I immediately want to shrink it, but I can. But it also gives me this variation percent number. If I give it something along the lines of, I don't know, 40%, that means that every particle can be either size of 15 or 40% larger or 40% smaller or anywhere in between. I can adjust further by going, let's say, maybe 30, 35, 40, whatever I feel is the best. Let's just go to 35 there. So I get some that are smaller, some that are bigger. All right. Next, now that our particles have been born and we've told them what to look like, let's tell them what to do. So under our shape, we're going to drag. We've created our gravity and our scene. We want to drop these things. So let's add the good old force operator up underneath our shape. And in that force, we need to click the by list button, which will open up our select by name dialog, and gravity should show up in there since it's the only force we created. Once the gravity's in there, our particles will start falling based on the strength of that gravity between 150, and then they'll just kind of fall through everything because we're not quite done yet, and continue on their journey into Nowheresville forever. But now that we've got our particles dropping, we're doing pretty good, we can tell what to do next. One thing I might notice is that my particles are all starting at exactly the same position in exactly the same rotation and falling straight down. Not very believable when it comes to natural movement. So the next thing we can add would be maybe a random 3D rotation. I'll add a rotation operator and just leave the default, which is random 3D, which initially starts them each at a different rotation and then sends them on their way. So things look a little bit better, just slightly different for each of our peas that are falling into this pea soup. We can also add a spin operator. The rotation changes the initial rotation, but the spin operator allows these guys to turn as they continue on their journey. The default for this as well is random 3D. I'm going to go ahead and change that one to speed space follow. If I change it to speed space follow, I get these X, Y, and Z spinners show up here. I want to put a 1 in each of them, which means they're allowed to spin in on any axis, X, Y, or Z. But the speed space follow tells them to favor spinning in the direction that they are falling. So they'll always kind of spin towards something rather than just randomly one goes the other direction. It'll always look like they're kind of spinning all the same by the direction that they are traveling. 360 is a bit much. Let's drop that down to maybe 100. We don't want them to spin fully. We're not giving these guys a fastball spin, but just give them the option to slightly turn. Some of them can turn if we add that variation. Let's put a variation of 75%, which means spin rate of 100. Some of them are going to turn at the rate of 100. Others can turn 75% more or 75% less than that. So some of them won't be turning much at all. Some of them will be turning quite a bit. And that'll give us even more of a natural feel as some of these guys spin just slightly as they drop. If you want them to spin more, increase that rate, and you'll get some of them spinning quite a bit. It's all up to you. I don't want mine spinning much, so I want 100 with a variation of 75. Alright, there we go. Our particles are falling, they're hitting the mud, and they're just falling right through it and continuing on, which means the next thing we need is something to tell them to, when they strike this mud, to do something different. That's going to be our collision down here. We've got our collision test. We'll call this one a test. All these ones that are in yellow with the warning sign looking icons here, these are all tests. What makes them tests is that they look for a specific condition that our particles are in. In this case, whether or not they've collided with a deflector in our scene. I'm going to add that one underneath our spin, select it. Over here on the right hand side with our settings, I'm going to hit the by list button once again. Our select by name dialog shows up, and since it's looking for something that works with the collision, which is our deflector, that should be the only thing that shows up in here. Our U deflector in scene, go ahead and select it, hit the select button. It'll add it to the list here. Then it's marking and it's looking for that collision, which happens to be our mud. Right now, since our collision was default settings, they're just going to bounce right off and right back up. Instead of bounce, I'm going to tell them with this drop down just to continue, because I don't want my mud to be bouncy. I don't want them to literally deflect things off. But I do want to use this guy, this little blue node that came along with our test, with our collision test, which allows it to send it into a brand new event. Just like this one connected to our first event, we can do it with a second one, which means once they collide, we can give them specific instructions on what to do next. So that's going to say, okay, great, once you collide with it, just go ahead and keep doing what you're doing, travel through this node and start something new. That something new is going to be something we put together. To get us going, I still want gravity to play a part in this. We've already created a gravity. So if I hold down the Shift button and see that little plus sign that shows up next to my mouse cursor there, if I hold down the Shift button, click and drag this guy down here, it'll give me the option to clone it. If I want my gravity to be different in each event, I would want to mark copy, but because I just want gravity to be gravity in this one, I'm going to go ahead and leave instance marked. What that means is if I change, let's say, the influence of our gravity here in the event, the second event, it'll also change the one in the first event. So then I don't have to go back and change everything later on. All I have to do is change one and it'll update for me. Once I have that new collision, we can connect that new event to our first event with that collision node by dragging that little blue node into our empty circle node in the second event. If I was really good, I'd be renaming these events by selecting the name there, right-clicking, and saying rename. We'll call this our particle creation, and we can call this our particle collision. event. And that gives us just a little bit more information, especially if we're working in a team and someone might need to come into our files and update them. Now what's going to happen if I look in my front viewport here, if I scrub down, and as soon as they hit, they're going to turn back into tick marks. Because along with every time we create a new event, we get a new display. I'm going to go ahead and change that from ticks to geometry. I'm also going to give it a brighter color. Let's go with like a yellow, bright yellow. So we can clearly see that once they've collided, there is something happening here. And that's, at this point, gravity continues to affect them because we've got a gravity in this guy here, as well as they just continue on their way, falling forever right through everything. Which brings us to the magic of this particular little particle experiment. The magic is going to happen with an operator test down here called the lock/bond operator. I'm going to go ahead and click and drag one of those up underneath my force. So while my particles, as soon as they collide, they get sent into this new event where gravity is still paying attention, but now we've got this lock-bond test, which we're not going to connect it to anything. We just want it to stay usable here. And this will allow us to utilize an object in our scene to make the particles stick to it, to tie those two things together. In this case, I'm going to click the Buy List button. I'm going to select my collision mud, which is going to be just the plane that we created. This gives us a choice. We can either lock our particles to this object, or we can lock them to the surface of this object. So almost like a sub-object. We're going to leave it locked to object, the entire thing, and then we're going to tell it how that object is going to affect our particles. In this case, we want our particles to kind of continue going through them, but then bob up and down as though this were the surface of a viscous liquid of some sort. In which case, as soon as it hits this lock bond, as soon as it hits this collision, which happens to be our surface, it's going to start paying attention to some of these settings here. I'm going to tell it to limit the speed as it hits. I'm going to tell it 1,000 is way too much. Let's try 200 to start. Which means it's going to fall, and because I've set the force here as default at 100%, it's going to immediately force those particles to stop at our object, which, okay, that's real thick mud, not quite what we want. Here's something kind of fun, though. If I reduce this amount, this force percentage, we're forcing these guys to lock to this object by 100%. If I just drop that by, like, down to 99, not 100%, but mostly, they're going to fall through and then kind of adjust. And that's where we get some of the simulation of our bobbing up and down liquid. We're limiting them to move only 200 at a rate of 200, and we're also forcing them to tie to this object almost entirely, but not entirely. So they've got a little bit of, literally, wiggle room. We also have some further instructions down here. We've got a dampening, and this drop down allows us to further tell these particles how to act once they hit the surface. We've got none, we've got one that's by friction, we've got one that's air and fluid, and we've got both friction and air and fluid. We want this to be some sort of a fluid, so let's select air and fluid, which will give us the ability to add even more resistance. 100 is default, and then the speed unit, we can add a resistance. Maybe we'll drop that to, I don't know, like 80. And you can just really kind of see how bouncy you want this. If you lower this even further, they're going to stop dead fast. If we raise this even higher, they're going to, you know, a little bit of spring there. So we want to go just a little bit less than our full resistance. We can increase that as well and get either more resistance or quite a bit less resistance. And it's a very subtle effect, but well worth playing around with. That's it. There's our soupy kind of plop and bob, bobbing for apples kind of look there. With less force, we'll get more of that swimming up and down kind of float. You'll also start to see them stay underwater or under the surface a little bit more. With a little bit more speed, you know, you're not limiting them as so much, so we can get that bob to go even faster. I'm going to stick with my 100 to 80%, or low, let's go with 99, 98% force. You decide what you like the best. You go like 95 and get them to bob. And then they disappear a little too much. Let's go 99. I want them to stick to that surface. Pretty good. I like that. Maybe give them a little bit more speed so they can move a little bit faster, like it's something really holding them up. All right. There's our lock bond. That's what we've got going on. But now that we've done that, we're going to need a splash, because if anything hits a wet surface, it's got to make a little bit of a splash. In order to do that, we're going to use another test. This test we will send on into another event. Let's add a spawn underneath our lock bond. Whenever you're adding a spawn, I recommend, the default is usually okay when we're only working with 20 to 25 particles, but always move your timeline slider to 0 whenever you add a spawn or a collision spawn, because you run the risk of generating an endless loop of particle creation with a spawn that could really crash your computer. Not so much of a problem with this one, but on others, let's say we're creating fireworks or something like that, you could really seriously end up with a serious crash. Now that we're talking about crashes, now might be a good time to save our sludge experiment so that if we do crash, we can come right back to it without losing too much information. We've also got our auto back taking care of that. With this spawn, we're going to go ahead and let it spawn once. Let's take a look at some of the settings here. We've got it to set spawn once, and it's got one time, as soon as it hits this collision, it's allowed to spawn. The lock bond's doing something different. It'll bob up and down, but that won't create enough action to create any real splash, just that initial drop down. So we only need to spawn one time. Each particle is allowed to spawn. That's what this guy does, this 100%. If I only wanted 50% of the particles to spawn a splash, I could just reduce that number. But I want them all to splash because that's better. And we can tell it how many particles to create upon this collision. 1 is boring, so let's give it something more, maybe like 35 particles here. If you want, you can give it a variation even, maybe 10 or 15%. That works fine. And then we should get, when we drop, each one of our particles is going to create, there they are, 35, give or take 15%, new particles. Which means we need to start being careful, because now all of a sudden our 25 particles, now 25 times 35 or so. We're going to send this blue node out into our next event, where we're going to sculpt our spawn. In order to do that, again, I want gravity to work all the way through this, so I can just select our force, either one, hold down shift till I see that little plus sign, and then click and drag to create another event. Instance is just fine in this case, and then I connect those two events. Every time I create a new event, I get a new event title as well as a new display. I'm going to go ahead and change that to geometry. I'm going to change that number to something other than that, more bold, like maybe red. So our splash is now going to look, all the particles for our splash will look red. The event 01, let's rename this by right-clicking on that header, selecting rename, and let's call this splash event. Alright, for our splash, we need to tell our particles they're allowed to jump back up. We've already kind of, the collision is happening, but there's our particles, and they just kind of continue now that I've told them to pay attention to gravity. They'll continue falling forever, which, you know, in more than 100 frames could also crash our computer. I want to tell them to spring back upward. In order to do that, we're going to use a speed by surface. Let's not use a speed by surface. Let's just use a regular old speed. Underneath our force, speed will allow us to tell them to start moving in a different direction. In this case, it defaults us with a long icon arrow. Our icon arrow is this guy, and it is pointing straight down. I don't want him to point straight down. In fact, I want the opposite. I want him to point straight up. So I could rotate this whole thing, but that wouldn't do me any good. I can just check this box that says reverse. And then our particles, as soon as they strike the new particles, the red ones, are going to jump up at however fast I tell them, in this case 300, Eventually, gravity catches up with them and says, "No, come on back down." So they're shooting out again at 300 and coming back down, which actually just makes them all look like they're bouncing. You might see a lot less red ones because they're all going in the same direction. They're all on top of each other. So each one of these probably has 35 particles bouncing up and down. Let's reduce that. I don't need a total of 300, maybe only about 65 or so. Maybe with a variation even bigger than that, 75 or 80. So we get just a little bit of, yeah, and there's our variation. You can see our particles spreading out again. Some of them are jumping a little higher than others, some of them not so much. Now, we can change this depending on how viscous you want this liquid. If I want it to be thick pea soup, I don't want these guys to splash very high. If I want it to be water, maybe they're allowed to splash even higher. Let's stick with our pea soup, and I like the way that they're working right about there. Some of them will stay real low to the ground, some of them won't splash hardly at all, and some of them will jump fairly high. Straight up and down jumps, that doesn't create a splash, so that's what this guy's for, divergence. Let's give it, let's say 40% divergence, and then we get something that resembles much better a splash. If I want a little bit less, 30, 35, oh, 35, I like 35. And we just get a little bit of a bloop, and then we can continue on our way. Then they continue falling pretty much forever. We don't want them to fall forever, so we can add, because we're not going to see forever, right? All the way down here, we're not going to be even looking at. That's not part of our animation. It's not part of our simulation. So the next thing we can add would be let's try a delete. This delete, we don't need them on screen for much. Let's see our first. Right now, since it's default at delete all our red ones disappear. Let's change it to biparticle age. We don't need for much. Let's try maybe 20 to get going, to get started, and see what happens. We don't need a variation on this either, because this is just getting rid of them after they've already disappeared beneath the surface again. Okay, 20. We don't need quite so much, 20, maybe 15, and see we're starting to get, as soon as they go back underneath the surface, we're pretty good. So as long as we don't get them to start disappearing while they're still on top, we should be okay. So I say 15. 15 seems to work okay. Splash, 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 and then disappear. You might even be able to fine and tune it even more. 12, 13, 13. It's all just take a look. As long as they're not falling too much farther underneath, forever, 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 we should be good. So now we've got the plop, splash, plop, splash, plop, splash. All right, I think that's pretty good. I think our splashes, however, are a little bit too large. In order to scale down, like our original one is causing some smaller droplets, we don't want them to be the same size as our peas in our pea soup, so we can add a scale. We can have the scale, honestly, anytime. I'm going to put it at the top so that it rescales these guys right away. And we'll leave that at overwrite once, and maybe we'll have them about 50 or 60% smaller. And then we can give them a variation. As long as these constrained proportions are check-marked, I only need to change one value, and it'll change them all. So maybe 30% difference. So we get some that are big plops and some that are little plops, but they're all smaller than the original. And there's technically, that's the end of our particle effect. We no longer need these need to worry about these particles. Now we need to worry about our scene and coating some of this stuff in maybe a Metaballs material, as well as giving our scene some texture and some extra animation. In order to do this, I'm going to go ahead and jump out of here. All right, at this point, I guess the next thing we can do would be to unhide our collision, not our collision object, but the other one we made. Let's go right-click, unhide by name, and let's select our renderable mud and click the unhide button. Renderable mud shows up. It's the guy with 60 faces on our plane. We want to make these guys look as though they're being almost tightly hugged by this surface. The other surface is just for our collision. If you don't like looking at it, you don't like fighting with it, there's a trick we can do. If we select our collision mud you can right-click that guy, go into its object properties. And I like to, once I'm done with it, to go ahead and turn on the display as box. You can also freeze it. I don't like it to be shown in gray at all, so I'm going to uncheck the show frozen in gray and then just say OK. It'll make it so that you cannot select that collision shape. It'll also make it so that you don't see most of it, just the bounding box edges. So here's our mud. Let's change that from realistic to shaded so we don't get those annoying little viewport shadows. Here's our mud that we want to actually be in our final version. It's pink, but we'll texture it on our own later on. Let's do some fun animation that we can kind of do alongside our particle event. In order to animate a reaction of, let's say, a model in our scene, in this case our renderable mud, in order to have something like it, an actual mesh shape, interact with our particles, we need to turn our particles into a mesh shape. These guys aren't actual real polygons. They're just particles that happen to have the shape of said models or objects or polygons. So we need to turn them into actual mesh shapes. In order to do that, we use a compound object 3D Studio gives us called the mesher. The mesher is found in our Create tab and on our standard geometry button here, and the third one down in our drop-down list, compound objects. Mesher should be one of those that shows up. Our blob mesh is another, which we'll use to coat our splashes. But for the mesher object here, we want to turn all these particles into actual polygon shapes there. Let's click the mesher button, and in our top view, I'm just going to click and drag the mesher icon out. Before we assign it to anything, it looks like this dorky kind of half-built pyramid. Once we've got one, I can move over to the Modify tab, and it has a Pick Object button. This object can be anything that you've animated that you want to kind of turn into a specific or a singular polygon animated shape. I'm going to go ahead and click the None button and choose our icon or our polygons or our particles, which will select the PF source. Right away you should see a mimic of our particles that happens to be the same color as our randomly generated default mesher particle object. If I say let's change that to bright pink, all of our polygons for this thing will be pink because this is just taking that shape from the particle system and making a copy built from actual polygons or actual mesh shapes. You may also notice that they're kind of falling in completely off to the side here. That's because we have to have the mesher object at the same location as our particle source in order for this to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come down here with my mesher object selected, and I'm just going to center it, which means that those mesher shapes are going to be exactly on top of our particle shapes. If I hide the particle system, the PF icon, the mesher loses that data that's already kind of inside there for it. So it goes away, it vanishes. So I want to make sure that that's always there for it. So leave that thing unhidden. Whoops, unhide all. And then our mesher shape should be right on top of that guy right there. If I move it out again, there we go. It should be functioning. So 0x and 0y, 0z, all zeros, and now they're on top of each other. We can use that to do this for us. Another thing, let me move this off to the side again just so we can see what's going on separately, is I don't need all of our particle flow events for the mesher object to interact with my mud. In fact, I only need the ones that are going to bob up and down, these yellow guys. So I can tell it, instead of using all p-flow events, I can uncheck this, and I can add specific particle flow events. In this case, the particle collision. I don't need creation, and I don't need the splash for this, which means they're only going to show up when they're bobbing up and down inside of our particle event. Once I've got that, I can go ahead and right-click that X again, and they'll move on top of this. I can come into my particle flow view, and in the particle collision, I can turn off this display by clicking the icon, and then we'll only see the measure object, and those yellow ones will be basically hidden because they're all grayed out here. We can turn them back on or off as we need them. X out of there. Now that I've got that done, I can tell this measure shape to actually interact with our mud here by adding a couple of modifiers. Let's select our renderable mud and add a modifier to the list. What we want to add is the volume select. Very useful. Okay, our volume select, we've got some settings changes to make. I want it to select by vertex, which is our smallest sub-object, so we'll get more detail out of it. And I also want to tell it to add to the selection based on, so we'll select add, and then we'll come down here based on a specific shape. You can do default shapes like boxes, spheres, and cylinders. You can also use a mesh object. In this case, we want to use the mesh object, so anything that comes into contact with this thing, it's going to select the particles near it. If I click the None button that comes along with our mesh object, I come up here to our Select by Name button, and I can select our mesher. It looks like I've got two meshers in there. I think number 2 is the one we want. Select Mesher 2. Yes, that's the one we want. So I don't know how I got another one created. I want to select Mesher 1 and delete it. I don't need it. But what you'll see happening is as Mesher 2 takes over, let's turn this back to wireframe so we can see. You'll see some of these vertexes getting selected when they're in contact with that pink mesher object. There's one right there. We can make that a little bit more noticeable by coming down even further and using the soft selection. Let's turn that on and we'll see a rainbow color. And all the way around we'll get from hot to cold colors a selection of this. If I, let's say, shrink that down, we don't need quite that much, maybe 9 or so. 9 looks good. And then we can add maybe some pinch. We can go 5, which will kind of turn it all cool, and then add a bit of a bubble too. We get a rainbow-like effect that's going to select some, less, and then more. What that's going to give us, if we add another modifier on top of here, let's go with that one. Let's add the push modifier. And what that's going to allow us to do is whichever particles, or vertices are selected at that point, we can tell them to push up or down. In this case, I think down is what we want. Let's go with a -5, which gives us this kind of mounding effect as our mesher hits the surface. It's jagged for right now. I'm not sure we need maybe quite that much. Maybe there we go, -3. But that gives us kind of that hug effect of a mound of mud as these guys slap into it. We can then, on top of that, add, let's say, a turbo smooth with a couple iterations, which gives us a ton of those guys. But the effect is actually quite nice there. All right, that's part 1 of our animated surface that's going to go well for us. Now we need to worry about these splashes. The splashes, we're going to use another compound object, so back to our Create tab, Compound Objects, Blob Mesh. It doesn't matter where I create this, I'm just going to create an icon in the scene by turning it on and then clicking somewhere in my scene, and we'll get the Blob Mesh icon, which just looks like a very poorly crafted sphere until we add something to it. Over on the Modify tab with our Blob Mesh icon selected, we've got some settings to define here. The first of which is size and tension, which for right now doesn't matter to us too much. The evaluation coarseness will matter to us. As well as, before we even get to those, the blob objects. We need to add something from our scene. In this case, we can go ahead and click the Add button. Our Select by Name will show up. We want to open up our particle flow engine and choose the particle flow source icon for that as well. And then we'll hit the Add Blobs button. It's going to coat all of our particles in that metaball material, which changes shape based on particles near and far from it. I don't need all of them to create a splash, just that last event. So a little further down, under the particle flow parameters, we can uncheck the Use All Particle Flow Events and click the Add button down here to choose only, in this case, one of them, our splash event. Now we've got our particles, but as they collide, they create kind of a bubble up effect for right now. Come back up to the top here, and I like to put a check mark in the large data optimization. It makes it work a little bit smoother, a little bit nicer. As well as now we can change how jagged or smooth these edges are. We've got two numbers, one for the render and one for the viewport. The render should probably always be a little smaller than the viewport number. But if I just cut the viewport percentage down in half, you can see that we get more polygons and thus a smoother and more defined shape. If I put the render value to 1, when I finally click the render button up here, that'll be a lot smoother, a little bit nicer. We could try it in our viewport, but be prepared for a crash if it doesn't like it. 1's not terrible, so let's try it. We get kind of a very heavy and yet very smooth result. So to make our viewport work a little faster, we raise it up a little higher than our final render button. Alright, pretty much we are done. The only thing left to do is these annoying little splash polygons or particles here. We don't want the dodecahedron in the splash. All we want is for this guy and these guys to show up. So I'll hit 6 to open up my particle view again, and we can turn off the display for the splash as well. The data is all still there for our blob mesh, and we've created a rather cool bob up and down splash effect. All that's left is to texture everything. If you want to get clever, you can take our mesher object, you can add in the particle creation guys there as well by clicking the Add button on our mesher and choosing particle creation. Then you can hide that display in our particle view as well, and then you only have one object to texture, and that's our mesher object. Final result, something quite gooey. Alright, that's it.